All right, so today we're talking about classification. Again, we've mentioned this just a little bit earlier in the semester, but classification is a very important branch of science, if you will, because we have to, appreciate the idea of biological diversity. Okay, there are a large variety of living organisms and different ecosystems that they are a part of. So we have to have a way to identify and classify new organisms as we continue to discover them. And so classifying organisms falls under the branch of science that's called taxonomy. Write down that word, taxonomy. Taxonomy is the science of naming, describing, and classifying organisms. Okay, so in biology, the term classification means arranging organisms into groups, okay, based on similarities that sort of reflect evolutionary relationships. Okay, so if you and I were to go outside and sort of dig in the soil and find something that resembles a worm, we would like to be able to classify and identify that worm. So we would start to look at physiological, I mean, there are multiple ways to do it, but one of the first things we can do is try and look at physical features and characteristics of this worm. Right, and then go from there in terms of trying to identify, what class of organisms that this worm might be in. Okay, I mean, then we can also do it from a evolutionary standpoint and do some genetic analysis to further name or classify this particular organism. So suffice it to say that this is a very important branch of science that allows us to sort of organize and classify organisms based on, similarities and so forth. Okay. So this binomial system of nomenclature is what we use to sort of name organisms. And I like to think of it kind of like you have a first and last name. So all living organisms that we have discovered and analyzed from a taxonomic standpoint, we have designated it a nomenclature. Okay, so organisms are named using this binomial system of nomenclature that was developed by Carlos Linnaeus. Go ahead and write that name down. Carlos Linnaeus is the scientist who is responsible for developing this binomial system of nomenclature. And what it did was it allowed scientists to communicate more freely, to kind of work in a more uniform fashion for identifying and understanding or classifying organisms across the globe. Okay, and so this binomial system of nomenclature basically assigns each species a two-part name. Okay, again, think of it like your first and last name. All right, the first part of the name designates the genus, okay, that this organism belongs to. And we're going to look at this hierarchy in just a second, how we can assign an organism to their respective domains, kingdoms, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. So when we get down to, very specific characterizations of an organism, we're down kind of at that genus and species level. That's when we're very specific. There are very specific inclusion criteria that must be met in order for an organism to be assigned to this particular genus or species. So the first part of that name is the genus. The second part is designated as the species or the specific epithet. So when you're taking your exam in another week or so, you may be asked to identify some genus and species and just understand and interpret what this hierarchy tells us about an organism and how we actually use it. Okay, so right now, the first part of an organism's name, we're going to say designates or tells us the genus that it is assigned to, and that is plural, the genera, or the species. Okay, again, at the species level, this is where we have very specific organisms. Any organisms that are included in this species, they're going to be pretty much identical. Okay, they're going to have pretty much the same physiological makeup, functioning, and so forth. Okay, they're going to be pretty much the same organisms in a given species. There are some rules when we're writing the binomial nomenclature. Okay, the genus name is always capitalized. Write this down because, again, this will be important as you continue to matriculate through your biology courses. Your professors are going to expect that you understand these basic rules as it relates to identifying or naming an organism. These are rules that have to be followed. When you're writing the name of an organism, the genus is always capitalized. Okay, so when you're thinking about these aspects next week, I might have some questions to ask you to select which question has this name of this organism written correctly. Okay, so the genus is going to be capitalized, but the species is not. So think of it like this: first name is capitalized, second name is not. Now that's a little bit different than how we actually write our names. As proper nouns, we capitalize both of them. Okay, but we capitalize the genus, we don't capitalize the species. And then both names are underlined. Like if you're writing on your paper, like physically writing manuscript, you're going to underline the name of this organism at all times. So throughout the rest of your college tenure, if you're writing the name of an organism, I'm thinking about bacteria like E. coli. If you're writing E. coli on your paper for whatever reason, you're going to capitalize that E for Escherichia. You're not going to capitalize the coli, but you're going to underline both names. Okay. If you're typing using a word processor on your computer, that name needs to be italicized, not underlined. Okay. Both parts of the name must be used to identify a species correctly. So again, if I showed you a picture of something or somewhere in the question you're being asked to give the name of this species, then you need to be able to give me both the first and like both parts of the name, the genus and the species, to accurately identify a given species. So let's look then at how do we get down to this genus and species. So there's an hierarchy of organization for living things. Okay, these are taxonomic levels. Okay, are assigned. The organisms are assigned to a different taxonomic level depending on characteristics and features that it exhibits. Okay, the most general taxonomic level is going to be at the domain level. Okay, there's a 3-domain system that we use for classifying organisms. Okay, the domain prokarya, eukarya, and archaea. Okay, there's 3 domains. Okay, so every living thing that we've discovered, all right, can be classified into one of 3 domains. And we'll take a deeper look at that in just a second. The next taxonomic level would be the kingdom level. All right, we've talked briefly about the 5 kingdom system, and we'll look at that a little bit more today. The 5 kingdoms that exist. We have every organism can be classified into one of the 5 kingdoms that we recognize right now: the plants, animals, fungi, Monera, and Protista. After that, things are not as uniform across the board because the number of phyla, class, order, families, genus, and species can differ depending on the organism. Okay, so you will be expected to know the 3-domain system and the 5 kingdoms, okay, because these are not going to change no matter the organism. Okay, but what I want you to understand just by looking at this is that this is an hierarchy of classification. Each taxonomic level is more general than the one below it. Okay, the most general level of classification is up here at that domain level. And the classification really happens between the fact of whether or not this organism has a nucleus or not. Okay, so the prokarya, those are prokaryotes, those do not have nucleus. And then the eukarya, those are eukaryotes that do have a nucleus. And then we have archaea. Okay, now archaea is sits off in its own domain, but those are prokaryotes. But the reason they needed their own domain is because they had some very different molecular features, if you will, that did not allow them to be categorized in prokaryotes as bacteria. All right, they're more extreme. They have very different characteristics or requirements for living that they did not get categorized in our prokaryotes. But so I think I have another slide and another few slides that'll show you a little bit more about this domain system for eukaryotes, prokaryotes, and archaea. So when we're talking about taxonomic levels, each level is called a taxon. So write down this word taxon. Taxon is a formal grouping of organisms at any given level. Okay, each organism that's assigned to a particular taxon shows you know, a relationship between these organisms as far as the species is concerned. Okay, so if we start down from the bottom at the species levels, then closely related species are assigned to the same genus. Okay, closely related genera are grouped into a single family. All right, and so that's the relationship between this hierarchy that you see here. Okay, the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. At the species level, these organisms are all going to be the same. As we continue to group very similar species together, we then might have a genus. Okay, very similar genus or genera will be assigned to the same family, and it will continue to move like that. Phyla are grouped into kingdoms, and the kingdoms are grouped into domains. And we said that the domain level was the most general level of classification. And as we move down this hierarchy, okay, we get more specific about our inclusion criteria. And so the number of organisms at each taxon, at each taxonomic level, will continue to decrease as we move down this hierarchy. Okay, the number of organisms that are included are going to decrease. Okay, because now we're having more and more specific inclusion criteria. So anything from having a backbone, so vertebrates to invertebrates. Does this organism have 4 legs or 2 legs? Does this organism have, you know, how many extremities, how many eyes, and is it warm-blooded or cold-blooded? There's a number of different factors that we use to assign organisms to their particular taxonomic level. But as you move down this hierarchy, we're getting more and more specific about the inclusion criteria, to the point that when we get to the species level, we pretty much only have identical species or organisms. So an example here would be classification of humans. Okay, we are from the domain level, which is not shown here. We're in the eukaryote domain because we are eukaryotic organisms. We do have the presence of membrane-bound organelles and so forth. So the kingdom that we would be assigned to is Animalia, right? So I talked about that 5-kingdom system. All organisms are assigned to one of those 5 kingdoms. Okay, humans, we're in Animalia kingdom. Phylum Chordata, we do have a vertebrate backbone. Class Mammalia, okay. Order Primates. Family Hominidae. Genus Homo. And so what you're seeing here in the schematic is that each taxon level, as we move down this hierarchy, we get more and more specific. So the number of species of organisms that are being included is decreasing as we move down this taxonomic level, such that when we get to this species level, they're all going to be the same organisms. Okay. So if we asked you to identify the scientific name for a human, you would look at, you know, the schematic that's given to you, and you would come down to the taxonomic level for genus and species to identify the scientific name of a human, which you've probably heard before. It is a Homo sapien. Homo sapien is the scientific name for a human. And so again, I mentioned that we're taking this brief look at this, but I'm not going to expect you to learn all of the phyla, classes, order, family, genus, and species for all of the different organisms, because we just don't have enough time in this course to do that. But what I do expect you to be able to do is utilize the information. If I asked you questions about inclusion and reading and understanding and applying what this is showing you, I do expect you to be able to do that. Okay, and so we're seeing here that at the kingdom level, there's many different organisms that are included, you know, at this level of designation. All right, we've got everything from humans to this looks like a bison or something. We've got a monkey. We've got a little bit of everything. But as we continue to move down this hierarchy, we're getting more specific about the features that we're looking for inclusion. Okay, and as those inclusion criteria change, the number of species that are included continues to decrease. Okay, such that we get down to the final level of classification here, which is species is going to only contain a single organism. They're going to be all identical at this level, genetically identical. Okay. So this is just another schematic of the classification of dogs. All right. These are the domesticated dogs. At the domain level is eukarya. Again, we're in the domain that these are eukaryotic organisms. Okay, so that's the only factor of distinction here at the domain level, whether or not it has a nucleus. All right, at the kingdom level, we're clearly in kingdom Animalia. Okay, so we're talking about, again, multicellular animals. All right, but at this level, we can see there's a variety of species that are included at this level. All right, but as we continue to move down, now we're at the phylum level. These are this is phylum Chordata. So now we're talking about organisms with a backbone. So we still got quite a few different species of organisms present at this level of classification. All right, we continue to move down. Mammalia, so we know what mammals are. They have the sweat glands. They produce milk for their offsprings. Still quite a range of organisms that are present at this level of classification. So we're continuing to move down. The order Carnivora. All right. These are definitely animals that feed on other living things. These are meat-eating animals. All right. So the inclusion criteria is still getting a little bit more specific. So the number of species that are in this level of classification are decreasing. The family, Canidae, so those canines, all right, wolves, foxes, coyotes, okay, these are all now showing you how our inclusion criteria is changing. So the numbers and types of organisms at each level is also changing, all right. Genus, Canis, species, Canis lupus, okay. There are subspecies, again, depending on breeding, and when we start looking at domesticated dogs and special breeding, so we get these subspecies. But if you were required to, on your exam, identify, if you were given a schematic that looked like this, okay, and you were asked to identify the scientific name of a dog, okay, you would come down to this genus and species and tell me the scientific name, Canis lupus. Okay. So let's look at the domain and kingdoms. Okay. So I mentioned earlier that the domain level is the broadest, most general level of classification. Okay. So biologists classify organisms. Remember when I use the term organism, we're talking about any living thing. Okay. So biologists classify organisms in 3 major groups that are called domains. Write that down. The broadest and most general level of classification is the domain level. Okay. There are 3 main branches of domains in the tree of life. Okay. So we have domain bacteria, okay, or prokarya, depending on what you're reading. We have the domain eukarya. Write that down. And then we have the domain archaea. Again, we're talking about very broad, very general levels of classification here. So the only inclusion criteria here for domain bacteria is that these are going to be prokaryotic organisms that lack a nucleus, and they're going to be unicellular organisms. So we're mostly talking about bacteria. Okay. Unicellular prokaryotes. All right. The next domain level is eukarya. All right, very broad, very general classification here. The only criteria that this organism needs to meet is that it's a eukaryote. It certainly has a nucleus, and these organisms can be either unicellular or multicellular. So these can range all from anything from a unicellular yeast or fungi, okay, all the way up to a complex, you know, fox, dog, cat, snake. Those are all multicellular organisms. Okay, monkeys, humans, we're all in this eukaryote domain. All right. And then lastly, we have archaea. I briefly mentioned it earlier. These are prokaryotes. They are unicellular, but they differ structurally from bacteria and as far as their physiological requirements, they are a little bit more extreme. So they needed their own domain. They don't exactly exhibit all of the characteristics for bacteria. Okay, so those are the three domain systems. I do want you to be familiar with those. Okay. And so then we have our 5 kingdom system. All right, so all organisms that we have discovered to date and identified have been assigned to one of these 5 kingdoms. Write these 5 kingdoms down. Monera, okay, this is our bacteria kingdom. Okay, Monera, Protista, okay, this is where you find your protozoan organisms. Okay, fungi, plantae, and animaliae. Okay, these are our 5 kingdoms. Okay, this is still sort of a very broad level of classification or general levels of classification here. Okay, so all bacteria are going to be in the Monera kingdom. All the protozoan organisms are going to be, so like your amoebas, your euglenas, things like that, plasmodium, those are all going to be in Protista. Fungi, all right, so your yeast, moles, those are fungi. Plantae, so we're talking about all of our, you know, green plants, photosynthetic organisms, trees, plants, and so forth. They're going to be in kingdom Plantae. So remember, those are living things also. And then Animaliae, those are all of our other eukaryotic organisms that are not bacteria. Okay, so anything from a fish to a zebra to a human, mammals, those are all going to be in our Animaliae kingdom. Okay. And so again, from a general standpoint, if I showed you some pictures or images, again, this is sort of an overview, if you will, of classification. You should certainly have some basic levels of understanding to where if I showed you a picture of a mushroom or told you the name of a yeast or an organism, Candida albicans, and if I told you this was a yeast, I would expect you to be able to tell me which kingdom that organism would be assigned to. Okay. Which kingdom that organism would be assigned to. All right, so this is just, I know some of us are visual. This is just a repetition of what I just said as far as the 5 kingdom system. Monera, okay, these are going to be our bacteria. All right, this can also include some of our blue-green algae and other spirochetes. Protista, these are our protozoans and some algae can also be categorized in this domain, but mostly here we're talking about our protozoan organisms. Fungi kingdom, this is where we find our funguses, moles, mushrooms, yeast, mildew. These are all examples of fungi. Okay, these are eukaryotic organisms. All right, plantae, so we're talking about our plants, anything mosses, ferns, woody plants, flowering plants. If I showed you, you know, pictures of a fern, I would expect you to know that that's a plant and that it's assigned to the plantae kingdom. Okay, so, you know, basic interpretations and extrapolations are going to be expected. Animaliae, okay, these are our animals, all right, anything from worms, insects, amphibians, reptiles, mammals. So these are all going to be assigned to our Animalia kingdom. The phylum. All right, so phylum comes below kingdom. And I mentioned here is where things kind of get a little murky because the number and names can change depending on the organism. Okay, so this is the taxa right below kingdom. So if I went back up to this hierarchy here, so we talked about our domains and we talked about kingdoms. Now we're looking at phylum. Okay, this is a single phylum. Plural would be phyla. All right, depending on the kingdom, okay, depending on the kingdom, the number of phyla can change. Okay, so the number of phyla for animals is going to be different than the number of phyla for plants. Okay, so in this case, we're grouping organisms based on general specializations of the body. All right, so for example, here, the plant kingdom contains 12 different phyla. Okay, and so depending on again, the body arrangement or general features in the body, the organism will be assigned to one of that plant organism will be assigned to one of these 12 different phyla. Same thing as we're moving down the hierarchy, class, order, family, the names and numbers vary depending on which kingdom we're looking at. Okay, so we have animal classes such as mammals, we have reptiles, we have amphibians. So again, depending on the kingdom, the number of classes, order, and family will vary. That's what you should understand. Now, genus and species. Here, again, this is where we're now accurately identifying individual organisms. All right, so we're all the way down. Let's look back at our schematic here. We're all the way back down at genus and species here. We're clear that, you know, depending on the kingdom, the number of phyla, classes, and so forth, these will continue to change. So at the genus and species, this is how we now accurately identify an organism by name. Okay, we understand that this species, at the species level, it is the least inclusive. Okay, the least inclusive in terms of the diversity of organisms that's assigned here. So pretty much what we're saying is that at the species level, the organisms are pretty much identical. Okay, they're very similar. Okay, minor variations in the organism. All right. What questions do we have about this information?